gonna get started. So as usual, I love to be casual and handle these things out. I'm sorry for those that are online that I can't pass them to you, but hopefully we'll talk about them and you'll understand what's going around the room. So today's talk is going to be called Rapid Response Prototyping. And as you can tell already from some of the prototypes, I am going to talk a little bit about the work that I've done as Associate Director on the CU Anschutz Medical Campus. InWorks Innovation Initiative is what I was part of up until this last month, when the initiative has it's no longer moving forward. So it's fun to now look back on this work, and your director and I recently spoke, and I was lighting up about how amazing this period of time was for me as a designer in terms of using emerging technologies and working with clinicians in such an intimate fashion that I do that on an ordinary basis, but how to work so closely with them, that during that period, they were so concerned about the items that they needed and didn't have, that we were communicating with them 3 and 4 times a day, passing prototypes and so forth. So we'll jump in. That is that slide. Okay, so I don't know who's in the room, but I assume most of you will say, yes, I'm a designer of some sort. Depending on the audience, that's not always the case, right? So how many here think they're a designer? Yeah? Yeah? Yes. Yeah, I'd say so.
We're
okay.
Creative designers.
We'll see. So has anyone ever heard of Edward de Bono and lateral thinking?
Yes.
And so there's actually a research study where they wanted to see who's really good at lateral thinking, who's really good at divergent thinking. Everyone's familiar here? No, not everyone. Okay, great. So how many, if I were to hand out paper clips, I should have brought them. Those of you online as well, how many uses do you think you could come up with to use a paperclip? Any uses you want, like how many, if we sit here for the next hour, how many uses could you come up with?
Hundreds.
Hundreds?
Thousands.
Hundreds? So again, I have a creative bunch. I understand that clearly with these responses, but depending on the audience, they could say, okay, 10, 20, 30, maybe somewhere in there feels comfortable if I'm really pushing at 50. Sure. And so this research study looked at, if we were to ask small children how many uses they could come up with, 98% of kids, I'll have to quote me here, but somewhere under the age of 5 and under are 98% genius level divergent thinkers, meaning they could come up with nearly 200 ways to use a paperclip. 200 ways. And sadly, as we age, and not even very far, you can see in the text there, I think by the age of 8, you fall into 50% level of divergent thinking. So as we grow older, we're judging ourselves, we're being shaped by the environments that we're in, and suddenly we're not thinking about changing scale of the paperclip, changing materiality, changing its form, and so forth, like young kids do. So I say that a lot of my work is really trying to get people, especially on a medical campus, to go back to those childlike times of how can they be playful. And so how could I, sell that on a medical campus of clinicians that sometimes the way that they've been educated through science has them thinking of, I want to be right before I talk. I want to know I'm going in the right direction, right? And so a lot of the work we've done out there, we've called it, the sandbox of having them come and be a little bit playful and show them the power of creativity. So if I look at my work at large, at this point in my world, I've tried to simplify it. And really it starts out with, if we're going to design, any of us are calling ourselves designers, how do we even understand how we ourselves design, right? How has that been shaped by our genetics, our life experiences, our culture, and so forth? Like, how do we design? And I think this past year for me has been one looking back at that and saying, well, who am I and how do I design and how do I design best? And just spending a little bit more time there than I'd say I have in the last 10 years. So just encouraging all of you of always revisiting that, of understanding within yourselves, how are you designing? On that second level, how do you design with others? And I'd say in some respects, starting out in my undergraduate career, I was so driven by what are my thoughts? What is my creativity? And of course, you were competitive to some degree with your classmates. And it wasn't really for me until graduate education and study abroad that I became so fascinated with working with others. And oftentimes the more diverse the group was or cross-cultural, the more that fed into really important aspects. So I know in other countries, I was less jumping to conclusions about classmates if they were from a different culture, like giving them greater room before I judged. And I found that so healthy of like, oh, why can't I do that within my own culture, right? So when the language is different. So that's a big thing of looking at too. And so for InWorks, it was about how do we bring in people from different disciplines, a real wide range, and have them work on the projects that we're working on. On that third level, how do you create with others for others? And so I'd say a lot of the work that I've done on the medical campus starts there, that our end user is often a clinician. I've done a lot of work at Stanford University with a group called Medicine X, and now runs a program called SASSY. And all of that is about empowering patients through emerging technologies. And so much about the patient voice being that co-creator. So how can you understand how you're working with others, I think is really critical for others. And so during the pandemic, it was, collaborators we already had, clinical collaborators coming to us and saying, you're the group that said you can make anything. We need your help. Like our lives are dependent on this. Like we really need your help. And so how did that help us in our cases of where we already had pre-existing relationships? And when you don't, how do you build those strongly so that you truly, in a human-centered design fashion, understand your end users? So on that fourth level, I think is where I'm striving for most of my work, but it doesn't always get there. Me saying that feels like the ultimate to me of how do you design yourself with others, for others, and now how do you bring the end users in a little bit further as actual co-creators? Like how can you as a designer set the stage where any of your specialized end users start to see themselves as co-designers, even if they aren't designers? And so in the work today for COVID, I want to just share that so much of the work that we've done, and we've published on the process with the director of quality control from surgery, but they would keep referring to themselves as the clinical voice or the clinical expert. And I'll show you how there are moments in our process of where they truly were the lead designer. They were leading the changes and so forth. Order here, but really saying that fourth level is inspired by the work that I've done at Stanford Medicine X, of just saying that patients healthcare and many are trying to do that, and how do we support and empower that? How have emerging technologies done that? So the conference would really focus on putting patients on those stages and telling their stories. So at the root of it, and a lot of the work that I've done in California has given me that opportunity to work on design thinking. I know, so I graduated long ago from here, CU Boulder, with an architecture degree. And so sometimes in wider circles, when you say you're a designer, everyone thought you knew exactly what design thinking was. And I can be the first to say in those early moments, I didn't. But I hadn't gone through formal training and so forth. So my informal training began out there teaching some of the workshops with IDEO team members, Dennis Boyle, and the former director of innovation for Kaiser, really great people in this space that I just sort of threw myself wholeheartedly into, saying, I want to learn these frameworks, but overall, I see the value in going back to looking at the world and saying, what we're designing, does it actually work for the humans that we're serving? And I know that's come a far way, and there are so many iterations of it. So I just usually like to show that it's not a static one diagram. It's been evolving over time, and how do we continue to migrate what that is. I love to show, just the history of it. There are many people that have been part of it. And so when I would try to take that and package it for CU Denver now in some of our courses on human-centered design, on occasion, I had a student that had taken an IDEO workshop in the past and would say, oh, you're doing it wrong. We're not on this step. You are prototyping too soon. And so I kept trying to get people to understand that because we're surrounded by equipment, especially at CU Denver, a large build-out space with equipment that you have here, and maybe some larger CNC routers, laser cutter, things like that, that our version of design thinking so much focuses on that making, even from the earliest stages, right? Of how are we just thinking or communicating with peers? And to do that, we start making, right? So it may not be the thing that you're designing for the end user, but just start making to see people's reaction. So I had a student that actually started as a high schooler and could out prototype most of my graduate students because they would just start making these interesting things with, you know, glue globs and rubber bands. And so then you suddenly look at it and be like, oh, it could be this, or it could be that, or it could be, and that really fits, I think, my orientation of design of just how can we think so wide? So now, you know, my life's work right here, another simple chart, like most of us are this, you know, I was, still am, I guess. It's amazing what you can finally do when the deadline hits, right? Like the 11th hour. And so I always say, like, you know, your final shouldn't be your final. It should be like put back 3 weeks, because then you get the actual input from people. And then you're like, oh, here's what I should do next. And so my students resented that, you know, I always say you're not done and we're going to do the final 3 weeks early. But how do I get the graphic to look like this? Like, how do I get them to constantly think through making, right? And how do I do that is I put a lot of deadlines. That's the only way, unfortunately, as humans, that we'll do something, right? So you have to pressure it to get them to output. And so how do we do that, you know, and get, especially in my background with architecture students, I don't know if it's still the same today, but it was always about the craft and the beauty and the corner. It's perfect. And now I'm like the opposite end of the world where I'm like, just make it. I don't care. Just make the idea, because your idea is such a low resolution idea that it deserves that level of output to, I'm preaching to the choir here, I can tell. So there was an activity I almost wanted to do today, but it would eat too much time, or maybe not. But it's a backpack challenge. I probably shouldn't show you because we could do it on another occasion. So I give all the participants like 6 minutes, and I say, give them a long sheet of paper and tape. And if I really want them to fail, I put pens out, markers. And so I say, I'm going to give you a few things. I'm going to give you time, and here's your paper, here's your tape. And okay, make a backpack, which I'm describing as at the end of 6 minutes, it can't be in your fingertips. It has to be worn by a team member and has to hold something. Like, that's all I'm asking of you. And typically 85, 90% fail. I say, well, what happened? And they say, well, you didn't give us enough time. So there's that strategy always of how do we as designers just output something, and how do we use time as a strategy, which architecturally I was awful at, right? I was always going further and further on the concept. And then my ideas up here would never match the model I showed. It was all talking. And so then some ordinary backpacks come out, and I'm like, okay, if anyone passed, you have like 2 paper straps, and it's pretty uninteresting. So then you have to, you know, creative driver, and you say, okay, now match it with an animal, mate your idea with an animal or something. So I give them less time, 5 minutes, more tasks, and suddenly everyone can do it, right? So I think that's the nature of what the type of work that I've been teaching and doing really then set us up, I suppose, for the pandemic. And only to say there are a few things just from our greater body of work that would be fun to show as well. But we've done a lot of 3D printing, clinically speaking, pre-surgical planning. And so at moments we'll just say, well, we have a 3D model. I guess tomorrow we start VR. And the team will say, that's nuts. We don't have anyone that does it. But we, you know, we start and find a student, and next thing you know, now have a beating heart. Surgeons were coming to our lab on occasion to do sort of a walkthrough of anatomy versus just having it in their hands. So I think you're all familiar, but how are those technologies shaping the way that we're understanding our world? How are they shaping how we're designing for it? Okay, I suppose if there's a photo to illustrate what I mean by rapid response prototyping, it's this one. So going back to the storyline that sounds like we share a little bit. So InWorks was interested early on of okay, we're all being sent home, but clinicians are saying we have to help. So what are we going to do? And here starts that story. And I think the uniqueness that I hope my team from the clinical side brought in was, wait a moment, before we just start making, we need the clinicians involved. We instrumentally need them involved from the earliest moments. And how are we going to do that? So what you're seeing in the photo is an early Prusa design that we didn't make. It was sourced online. I think I have the slide in here. But what is the clinician saying before the team starts making thousands of these? What's any ideas what the clinician's like? Yeah, right. And so this crowd knows that is a really fast change in Rhino or your software of choice. And then the laser cutter can adapt that. We were using, I'm forgetting the name of the shop now. Glassmith 2 has a nice industrial laser cutter in Boulder here that we were using for cutting these. So this would make sense now and not 3,000 shields later, correct? But this is kind of the way the world works often, where we just output it. We want it to be perfect and show them a shiny object versus getting that input. So I don't know who's going to have a problem with this, but I've always had a little bit of an allergy to calling design problem solving. And I feel like the entrepreneurial culture has really highlighted that, because you can't get on stage and say, well, I want your money, but we're going to sort of kind of solve your problem, but maybe not. And we're going to cause new problems, but I still think your money would be helpful, right? But in my world, I just see sometimes when we're trying to solve something, we isolate a few parameters and we say we're responding to them holistically, doubt it, right? And it's not going to work for everyone. So in a good and bad way, I almost want to give more levity by saying design is really about possibilities. It's about searching for the future, right? And it's not going to work for everyone. But we're going to try our best and we're going to learn and we're going to keep adapting. That's how I see design. And so I love Edward de Bono that just talks about, we just keep going. Sometimes my students would have trouble with this because they're like, no, but when is it done? I'm like, it's not, life's work. And so he talks about, this is a word missing from the English language, right? I don't know how you say it, but this word is missing and it needs to be in there. And so in the pandemic, I invented this word by just saying, like, nothing we were doing was excellent. And we had to just sort of swallow that and say, well, this is a really intriguing exercise, right? Despite the pressure of feeling like people's lives depended on it. We could do nothing and no one is helped, or we could do something that's sort of way too fast, not perfect, but let's try to help. So that was where we found ourselves. And so these are some photos early on from around the world. And, now they look funny, but in a prototyping sense, they're really interesting to look at, right? You can just see what the intention is, what they're trying to do. You can see where the seams are, where the tape is. And so these are kind of models I always want my students to make. But if they come to the university and I ask them to make paper napkin models, right? They're like, what? This is not what we do in architecture. But look how much information, 10 minutes at your dinner table and you're starting to understand how this thing comes together, I think is fascinating. So a few of the design thinking prompts, right? Like, how are we visual? In our case, we made the masks that I'll show you, but we weren't going to assemble them. We had to package them. So we're like, oh, if we can't communicate how these things work, doesn't matter what we've prototyped. So navigating uncertainties. The wild ideas. That's not ours, but these are online. And hopefully you're going to do that with all stakeholders at the table. So instead of problem solving, if you think of design in a human way, as a dialogue, as a materialized dialogue, how am I going to give materialization to that early on? And sometimes I like to reference that my early childhood aptitude test, I was very high in math, but there was a particular category called listening, and it was very low. And I care a lot about human-centered design, right? But I'm always trying to tell people, like, we have to think about the different modalities that we're gathering information, because what if I'm this great designer, but my listening aptitude is low, which may be different than observation or, you know, seeing how somebody tries on my product. But sometimes we isolate and just say these long style interviews. It's not going to work for every designer necessarily. So if I have to find an analogy for design, it's this. It's sailing. Is anyone sailing here?
Yeah.
Again, here we go. So if I'm wrong in my explanation, it's going to be very general. But when there's a sail race, there's a known starting point, there's a desired endpoint, and everywhere in between is what?
Exploring.
Say again?
Exploring.
Exploring. I thought you said boring. I'm like, oh, wait. Exactly. So everything in between, you know, there are weather predictions that are usually wrong, but we can't know how we are going to react until we're live in that moment. And how do we counteract the wind? And so I feel like that's what design is. And so sometimes we try to like figure out the end and back chart how we're going to arrive there. And I think that's a really wrong approach because it doesn't allow you that ability to be willing to pivot and to change your location based on what the feedback is. And so finally now getting to the pandemic work, we were all sent home and we're like, well, right, we're starting there. So the first thing, I think this is the early days, this was the very start of Make for COVID of I'm like, I'll make a Slack channel, right? We'll start talking about it. And I was getting calls from Stanford as well saying, I think your team, like, what are you going to do? This is big and so forth. And so one hand was looking what the rest of the world is doing and then start moving, start getting ready with that. So how do you be that rapid prototyper? Well, a lot of times you have to put your ego aside too, right? So instead of us designing a new shield from scratch, if these were out there, you can put them in a clinician's hands now and get feedback no matter what they are. And so that was really the target of saying face shields kind of seem like an easy one. Let's do that lift. And so our group, particularly really now the InWorks Denver group was fostering then that community and here and all the printers and suddenly everyone's getting started with printing.
Yeah.
Is there any irony in that? Does anyone see anything odd about the fact that we're printing thousands of these? How many know a little bit about 3D printing? A little bit, yeah. So if you want to make thousands of the same thing,
Yeah. Why are we printing?
Yeah. So this was again a really unique time because the only reason this made sense is because no one had access to anything else. So if we want the printer to make the same thing over and over again, it's like, well, at least it's a little community-based manufacturing that otherwise we didn't have. So just to say that, because sometimes those that don't know 3D printing, I think, get a little bit confused and so I like to throw this in there. Let me check on my, I have until 12:30 in total with some, okay.
Yeah.
So this is back, I did my postgrad at the Institute for Advanced Architecture of Catalonia in Barcelona. And so just to say this video, I think the date's on it's hidden, but it was like 2009 and is my favorite video to explain 3D printing, not the technical side of it, but the implications culturally.
Yeah, but okay, it'll be here. That's not design.
Down. Chair. Stay tuned. Chair, transfer intention.
The chair was. You go get it.
So I think you like that one with me. So that was, I think, 2009, around then. And so just to think even, should I move this out of the way?
Yeah, that's fine.
It's okay. Well, just to think how 3D printing has come along, and so predicting whether or not that would involve food, and now there are examples of that in gastronomy and medicine, and there's a FDA 3D printed pill that's many years ago. So a lot of those things have come true and continue to be built on. But I know, especially our work at the medical campus, sometimes the print is such the beautiful object. I think I didn't put those images in this particular presentation, but it's often what gets the media and the magazine coverage. And a lot of times we're trying to say it's the thing that brought us all together. It's the mechanism that allowed us all to communicate. And yes, it might be beautiful, but it's more beautiful the people that have worked together or from different disciplines been able to understand one another's work, and clearly all the cultural shifts as this video highlighted. Okay, so in Barcelona, I studied digital fabrication, and it was all about understanding how the machinery works, right? And that's a really sort of seductive way as a designer that tries to like not misuse the machine or the efficiency of the machine. And so this was a moment in time at the beginning of the pandemic where I started to see a shift between one, people I had educated felt responsible, and two, a lot of colleagues that around the world do amazing digital fabrication in architecture and other fields. And they were looking at this like, oh, that 3D printed Prusa, I mean, that's ridiculous. Like that's such a slow print. There are such more sophisticated ways or simplistic ways to make a design that won't, you know, misuse the printer, or it would be flat packed with laser cutting. And believe me, I have been that person for so many years. I actually have an award for one of the best designed restrooms in America. It's in Minturn. It's a CNC routed bathroom wall that I guess people love because it's uniquely shaped, right? And I obsessed over how to lay out the production and how to not have material loss and less cutting. I get it. But here, it was the first moment where we would hand clinicians like, you know, laser cut flimsy shields, and they'd be like, no. And we would take them to the Prusa, and every time they were like, this is what we want. Because if you just feel it, I'll pass some of these around, they're robust, right? And there's elastic, you can put them on if you so choose. And so they knew they were going to have one shield they'd have to reuse. So they felt like these are their battle shields. So they name them. This is Children's Hospital later using the shields that were delivered by Make for COVID. I think we took 5,000 there. And so thinking about the human side of the story, not as designers, what's seductive for the machine and like beautiful for how it works, but what will serve the human. I think that moment in time was like a wake-up call to me of like, I really had ventured far into human-centered design and began to appreciate that if a human uses something, you know, that's the efficiency. And of course, we ran into all kinds of issues of the elastic changing. This is again the sale race of everything moving, and how are we cleaning these things? So the community initiative had attracted various industry partners, which was really great. Because again, what is your technology? What would that be best for? And so if everyone would try one of these on, I brought these out earlier. This is a 3D printed, so you can look at it, you can feel it has a little bit of a texture. So it's basically a nylon powder that gets sintered. This is an HP, I forget the model. Like Multijet, I think is what they call it. Yeah. There's a company in Loveland, they're fantastic, called Avid. And we worked closely with them during the pandemic as I started to fold back into the medical campus from the community efforts. And so this is really lightweight. So again, thinking about your end users, you know, is a surgeon going to put this on their head? If you know anything about surgeons, the first thing that realize, right, their work is like this. So they're very fussy with what is going to go on their head or any weight. And so this is one that they really preferred, that the community offered, that again was printed. And so if you've seen a printer like this, right, it has that large 3D build volume. And so it was designed in a way that they could print however many that is, 50 plus overnight. So while we're printing one Prusa, you know, so thinking about those affordances for different use cases, but how is this going to be preferred? And then there's the pandemic was fun because I went searching for all these different companies that I never knew about. There's one in Lafayette. They have a few names because they have a parent company, but Fusion is I think the main one here. They make all the mannequins for Target around the world. Wow. So they do rotational molding. And so everyone, of course, was looking how to come online, and they were making, they had silicone molds that they were pouring this and making. And they would do a nice job and package it, and such a wonderful company. But I kept trying to slow people down and say, before you make 1,000 of these, let's see who they're going to work for. Let's see if we can, you know, because is this adjustable enough? What's the first thing you see, this versus this? Great. Yeah. So I was like a little moving shop where I'd load all the prototypes into my car and then show up to the medical campus outside and meet with some of the surgeons and show them what we had. So this is in Lafayette, right? Doing a really nice job, but how do you remind yourselves to slow down your process at critical points and speed up at others? And so this was a moment where I took it to this surgeon I've worked with closely, and she said, No. I said, no, just put it on. No. Just put it on. And she's like, I can tell I'm never gonna. But this particular surgeon is one of those really divergent thinkers who comes in with a notebook of like 500 ideas versus the one surgeon that's like, this is it. Just need you to work on this. And so she starts playing with it right away, right? And was like, actually, this is reminding me that the way we work, it would be nicer to have one down here. It should be coming from the bottom up. And so that idea again of like, it's not even the final, but the fact that it's in her hands and is allowing her to think that I don't want that plastic coming down because that's going to keep hitting me, but I want it coming up. And so sure enough, there was a company that beat us to it, right?
Okay.
But look at that, like they're telling you what to design. And the fact that that's a co-creation process in that moment when you force them to try on your ideas. Okay, so the bulk of our work then became, they came to us and said, we're running out of N95s. So you have to make some kind of reusable N95 replacement. And I have prototyped, and again, I made a bathroom in Minturn and architecture, but I've never actually manufactured until this moment where they're like, you have to. I'm like, okay, here we go. And so in the community, one of the participants had a spouse as a frontline worker, and so was already investigating on their own, how can I help here? And so thinking about 3D printing, all the things that we could do that we couldn't do decades ago, where you can just pour your 3D print and pour silicone mold. So we're just buying silicone at the craft store and we're pouring that. That might be a hard version. I don't know how many of you remember there were companies around here where the NIH 3D print exchange was validating some mask. I still don't understand for the life of me how some of these worked, because it's porous, it's going to get dirty. How do you clean it? Right? But better than nothing again. And so we started to take to the clinicians these early silicone versions, and they were really soft and pliable. And then we said, but this one's ready now, and somebody is saying that this will do something. And so what's interesting about prototyping is you kind of set a bar, right? Of once somebody tries this on and sees it starting to come to life, and they're like, no, we want this. You could have this tomorrow.
No,
we don't want that. We want this. So no matter what was available, we kept pivoting and saying, okay, we'll build off of this. And part of our, again, that race to create something, because there was a very small window to get your project into manufacturing before you missed it, was taking this model. But I will save you a long journey and say there's a reason half-face respirators have 2 filters, right? This one has a single one. Guess what? It's really hard to breathe out of that surface area when you're doing high impact, when you're doing resuscitations and stuff. But we began learning that, because this is the bad hair days. They all want to meet at 5 in the morning. This is the life of working with surgeons. But this is director of quality control. And so again, it's that multi prototype handoff every day, and that perfecting where they're saying, this is working, this isn't working, and so forth. That was really unlike anything we had ever done. Usually it's like, we're so lucky to meet with them for an hour this week, and then an hour next week gets canceled. So in another week. But during the pandemic, when you're touching base 3 times a day, here's another prototyping. Again, like when you give something to somebody, they believe it's becoming real. That's amazing. But then on the downside, if something that happens that they don't like, they also can become incredibly fearful. So you can try to assemble some of these masks. Okay, I sent you'll need a metal component. There's a little knob on the end, right? So the metal is going to go on the inside. See if you can do it. I just am limited by how many metal standoff components I have. But when we assemble a mask as the designers in our houses, right? We're like,
CU alert test. This is a test of the CU Boulder emergency notification system. This is only a test. No action is required. This is only a test.
Sorry, got hijacked it. Okay, what?
We're all good. So think about, we often think we understand and can think like our end users, right? I interviewed them. I know what they think. But here was a moment where we're sitting in our houses screwing these things together. They're in the hospital wearing full gear, screwing these things together, thinking the tighter I make this, this will make the difference between me staying healthy early days, me staying alive or not, right? So how much are they going to tighten it versus what we were tightening it? So any model we gave them, they just broke immediately. And they were like, never again are we using acrylic. And we're like, no, it's not the final acrylic. It will be thicker. It won't break. And they said, stainless steel. We're like, no, that's very expensive. And that we don't, but that was one of those moments where, because it was becoming real to them from the earliest moments, from there on out, it had to be stainless steel to give them that level of safety and comfort based on something breaking. So these are early 3D printed structures. We do have multi-material Stratasys printer in our lab. We have biocompatible material, which this is, but we didn't have the biocompatible material in stock. And so even that 3-week waiting period, we couldn't wait. So thankfully, OtterBox in Fort Collins had the printer, had the material. So these were all printed by OtterBox. So you just see a higher resolution print here than maybe what you're used to seeing from like a Prusa, right? Where these are now. Past those 2 iterations around. So back and forth with the hospital, we were on the 3D print task force for UC Health. And so the more we would accomplish, the more they would just like, if they had a challenge, they'd be like 3D printing, 3D printing. So they kind of would come back around to us. Here's a photo, which is so nicely taken. I spend like 2 weeks trying to get my students to like lay something out nicely, not with your dog in the background. Like documentary photography of these prototypes, nice, colorful background. This the clinician sent me. I mean, by the day they were turning into designer. And so because they would run stairs, they would, do code blue on the mannequins. And they're like, I'm not getting enough airflow. So he went home and tore out in his garage the inner structure and was like, can we find a way that this will still hold the filter medium? So becoming that, whether we liked it or not, becoming that co-creator. And then one evening, I think he tore out the screen in his window because he's like, we're going to need a screen. So they had to reuse the filter media. And they didn't want it to get dirty soiled when they were cleaning. And so he's saying, I think we need a little bit of a mesh, right? So imagine with all of our projects, how do we get an end user that engaged? Lo and behold, when we got the first batch, the material we requested, which was a skin safe, biocompatible material, somebody switched for a food safe, which are not actually, they're like humans. It's not the same thing. And so we were, of course, upset about that, but inexperienced manufacturers that we were, the team wasn't really paying attention to how sharp the edges were on the model because it was hand molded. And so not precise compared to injection molding, right? And now suddenly, depends on which mask you have, there's a really sharp edge. So you put the mask on and 4 minutes later, you're like, I can't even wear this. So you might be touching ones that have been, no joke, have been sanded.
Oh, that's nice. All right, yeah.
Right, so you go to all the effort and then the bridge of your nose, who knew, is so sensitive. And so the luck of the draw was manufacturer, you screwed up, but we really screwed up. So we get a second chance at trying to make this model a little bit better, right? And so there you go. Right? Because everyone's thinking, let's get that model off quickly. It worked on, the clinicians signed off, that's the one they want, not thinking that the you know, you hand pour something, there's air bubbles, the material is a little more pliable. Now we're trying to equate that to actual manufacturing. And then who left the edge on the model? Look at the edge. That's crazy. Why didn't I check that, right? And so the only way we can fix, we've professionally CNC milled out of metal, right? A legitimate mold for $10,000. So what can we do to our design? We can only take more material out of the negative, which is adding more material to our positive, right? So Play-Doh.
Nice.
So we had to figure out how to lessen that sharp edge by adding material. If that makes any sense. A little bit of sense, yeah.
Nice.
So the packaging, and then again, the clinician was like, you know, it's just not working. Even with the new design, now, okay, it's no longer 4 minutes, now it's 20, but you know, we've got to use this all day. But I went to my garage and I sanded it and it's fantastic. So of course, our digital fabrication hearts were a little like, what have we authored? And so we got on board, we all went to whatever that cheap store is where you can buy things that are gonna last a week. We all got our own sander here and hundreds of masks we were sanding, right? But if it's gonna work for the human. So that was that project in a nutshell. And as soon as, again, we were finding footing with printing, another team from surgery came to us and said, we'd really prefer to wear half-face respirators, and they had them. But pre-pandemic, guess what 3M and all the others didn't have? Is filtration for exhalation. Thing or something, you're not filtering your own breath, yeah. So they said, how quickly, what most tasks started out, how quickly could you make us an accessory that will filter the exhalation and deliver it to the CEO of the hospital? And at this point with our industry partnership, right, we were really getting rolling. So I have that here in my file somehow. I'll pass this around. But so same printing process. And they said, just remember, you know, like the bad Seinfeld episode, nothing can fall. For certain, this thing cannot fall off into the surgical field, right? It's going to land, you know, where. So this needs to work and we need to be so confident. And so within 48 hours, I think it was, we had this to the CEO's desk, and they were actually surprised about that. So that was a fun one because it was not only the prototype, but this would be final component. That's not wow. The only problem was, oh, this is being recorded. I shouldn't be telling inner stories, but so the surgical team was ecstatic. They said it was exactly what we wanted. And then the hospital said, we're not sure we're gonna proceed just yet. And the surgeons said, why? And they said, well, no one else has asked us for this. And so the surgeons were like, but no one else knows it exists. And so, right, that again, that world of possibilities, like also, is there demand for something until it exists? Or how do we know what is possible? How do end users specify that? So that's snapped onto the mask. And then we promptly made a meeting with 3M to be like, would you like to buy our, no, we're making our own. And since it exists now in full commercial. And I'm just gonna cruise, because I know we're out of time, through some last projects, but to say, whenever we could get stable enough as a small group on the medical campus, we were just a small group of 4 or 5 throughout the pandemic, primarily. But whenever we felt stable enough heading on a design, we would offshoot somebody to the next project to say, or the same project. This was saying, how can we create an adapter that will work with the existing mask we have to make it a two filter solution, since the airflow wasn't working, right? And so designing that, outputting that. Anyone know what this is? Our world got a little more real when they said, okay, we need ventilator components. How quickly can you do those? So that's just purely reverse engineering, but only to say we reverse engineer. I should give Avid all the credit for this. That was mainly under their product development. But again, as the designer saying legally, what can we do right now? This is a different landscape in terms of federal regulation, but still, how do we do something safely and with the patients in mind? So we thought the ventilator components were our limit, and then they said, how about a laryngoscope? We're running out of disposable ones. And the team said, no way, no. And so I just tried to get each and every moment the team to say, we can't judge this. We just need to design through it and see where, if there's a stopping point, we'll find it. But we shouldn't just based on intuition say, too risky. Does anyone know laryngoscope, right? For anesthesia, that's what's going down your throat. If you wake up after surgery, a little sore throat, that's probably because you've had a device putting the airway in. So we did do this. And again, it's, many of you know, if you want to reverse engineer something, how do we scan it? Okay, it's not working, it's shiny. Okay, we can code it. Okay, there's too much to fix on the model. We'll just model it ourselves. But the endpoint where we couldn't deliver on it was they put a little camera and a light down as well. And we just couldn't get that surface to enable the camera to do its thing. So the team was like, oh my goodness. But as things, slowed down, then it was the dental school saying, we want to get back online. We need a different shield, so forth. So those are a lot of the projects. But I hope today what you'll take is more so that idea of, even with what you're working on, how do you go out and make those contacts with your end users? And sometimes that feels like the hardest thing, to just go out and talk to somebody or find someone. But how can you do that? And how can you do that in a way that you are open-minded as to how that project's going to navigate? Because you will be surprised the level of feedback that you can acquire and how that will rapidly help you move along in your projects. So with that, I'll take any questions.
I have a question. So what material is this?
This is a nylon. So this is like a powdered nylon that fills that whole bed. It's an HP multi-jet printer, so you can look out more on the specific material, but basically gets sintered together, right? In terms of how it comes to be. And so have any of you ever worked with powder printers?
So it's like the laser printer, but the material is just placed on the plate, and then the laser printer just use the laser to glue it. Then it contains the shape, and then when it is like layer by layer, and then we can take it from the sand, and then the product can be again.
And so the effect is, right, you can print all of those at once if your design team can think about a way to then you have these articulating.
Yeah.
But it worked for clinical use too. And there's a secondary process on this that will smooth it. So this isn't ordinarily final surface.
Would you mind to answer your questions? For smoothness, you smooth it by your own hand, or would you have a machine to do it?
For this printer?
Like smooth the material.
So I know for Avid, when we worked with them, this was not our in-house printer, but this is a company in Loveland called Avid. The year we worked with them, they didn't have this secondary process in-house. They would have to send it out, but they've since gotten it. So there is some type of secondary finishing machine that will smooth this material.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So after printing, actually the material will be very raw, and then they usually use like the sand gun, like to smoothly with the actually sand, and it can like the texture of face.
Yeah. Yeah. You're saying by hand then? I think there's
secondary.
Yeah, secondary.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, robots.
Go ahead.
So of course, it's fantastic to work with your users every iteration and get their feedback. You do when smart people actually are clueless about the thing you're doing and give you really strong feedback that's actually incorrect.
Good point.
Doctors especially,
Yeah,
they know lots of things, but
yeah, it's a
they
good,
can't send an email to their grandson.
we have had that where, I think because at the end of the day, what we're trying to instill in all of our projects, as you're saying, is almost a human-centered design process. And that at times was at odds. If somebody said, I have this idea, I sketched it out, I made it in my garage, and all I need your team to do is this, just this. And so I think at the end of the day, you always want to work with good collaborators, right? And those come in many forms. Sometimes you may think somebody's not a good collaborator, but their obstinance could be a certain performative value if you come to find it. So sometimes we would just challenge them and say, okay, before you're looking to do this quality improvement process, or they were trying to invent something, like one, educating them on what that's going to take and all the steps. So in our case, like, you're going to invent this thing and you're telling me that you know others want it, and then you think the hospital is going to buy it. So there are all these levels. So just getting them back to that starting point of saying, before we do all that, can we do some analysis as to whether or not this makes sense? Or we had a project where we said, we're not going to invent the thing you're asking just yet, because we think there might be a quality improvement project that would be better for training the clinicians on how to improve this versus inventing a new gadget. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, we'll see if you're right. We'll start there. But I hear you. It's not, I do have an answer for you. What I say is you always have to deliver what they're asking for, right? But then you slip in the second thing. I do that all the time with my students of like, they asked you for this. You can't show up without this. You got to show up with this. But then you say, we just happen to make this here. And then you show a video of somebody using this and preferring this, or, you know, like you have to kind of socially coach them into like, you think it's this, but we're just offering that it might be this other thing. And then I also like, that's where I bring in really young students, and I set not to make it an age thing, it's more so on a medical campus, a hierarchy where I try to break that really sharply. And I would always bring a student that would ask the oddest questions, like annoying questions, right? And they start to see the process unfolding, and the fact that they've taken too many assumptions. It's like they start to see it by the questions that are coming out from the team, or a student prototypes something and they often prefer it themselves once they see it. So we had that as well. We did an OR board management project, and they came in with a really model that was made in the garage. And in that case, the innovation team said, we just don't see this as patentable. And I said, give me a minute. Like, I have a student that will, figure out a way that mechanically it's going to work more sophisticated than this. And sure enough, what they came up with not only was patentable, but it just worked better for how the clinicians were going to engage with it. So you can't convince them verbally, I don't think. So you show up with what they asked you, and then you make this model better.
Yeah, I mean, you said the word education, and your client has to be open-minded to learn things along the way. You have to be, I think, humble enough to say, we don't really know yet, because we're experimenting too. And I think that's changed. I was a product manager for many years, and if you start from the customer is always right, customers are not always right. They don't really know what they want. They like free lunch. And you have to give them something and say, well, let your team try this, and let's get their feedback and work on it together. Oh, that's interesting. It turns out, but in a situation like this, medical crisis, it's like, I don't have time to listen to you, build the thing we want and be done with it. So, if we all came from the perspective of some of the early slides about, continuous innovation and open-mindedness.
Yeah.
But we don't always have that luxury. So when you graduate and you get a job, just ask them some hard questions about, what if the assignment you gave them is not actually what you wanted?
Yeah, and I think you used the word collaborator. I know that kind of came in hard for me, where I'll go back now to the architecture program and they're always saying client, client, client. And I'm like, client? So we did a design build with the city of Denver and they kept saying, we're your client. I said, you're my collaborator. You know, we're equal in this. That's how it's going to work best, not to just have power for no reason. But I think there's something where I noticed I stopped using the word client or customer, or how do you set it up in the beginning that this is your collaborator?
Or even partner,
Exactly.
right? In October, there'll be a celebration at NCAR where one of our Atlas classes worked with our partner at the National Center for Atmospheric Research to build an exhibit. And they changed from build this to, well, you know, how do you engage someone in 8 seconds when they walk through your visitor center? And why does all these things are heavy text and graphics, black things on the wall don't really do anything? They don't work. So these are our observations.
Yeah.
So they changed the word client to partner early on. And so now we have a successful thing. David can tell you all about it.
Agreed.
Thank you. That was
You're
wonderful.
very welcome.